Okay. Praise the Lord. I went to a seminar once on sound, and they said, whatever you do, avoid wireless. Because they said, and they quoted that verse that the devil is the prince of the power of the air. And that's totally out of context. But right now, I think it's true. This was a heavy week in the life of our body. And last night, I happened to be looking at my computer at 6:41. I decided to scrap what I was going to talk about today, and I changed exactly what we're going to be talking about, spend our time together. And I do need to take off right away after this, so I'm not going to open up for questions tonight. I need to kind of bolt out right away. I'm trying to get to St. Cloud in time to meet somebody over there, going up to Brainerd for a few days here for a pastor's study break, which will be great for the pastors, I hope. But I got a phone call at 6 o'clock in the morning on December 27th. My cell phone rang. Now, Carol and I and the boys, we're definitely not morning people. We are not morning people. We generally stay up late on this kind of thing. We like games. I think we like games. There's just so much trash talking. I have raised my boys so much trash talking. It's amazing. They're more competitive than I am. So we play games till 2, 3 in the morning during Christmas break. It's just kind of what we do. And the phone rang at 6. It woke me up from a dead sleep. And then Carol looked at it. Before I picked it up, she just said, nothing good happens when somebody calls you at 6. And unfortunately, it wasn't good news. It was one of our elders, Mark Hintz, was on the line. And between sobs, I could make out that they were at the hospital. And Meg, his wife, was 35 weeks pregnant with their little one. And they had lost the baby. Everything was fine, but then they had the placenta just burst. They don't even know why. They don't exactly know what was going on. And so it was heavy. I mean, that's a heavy deal. And so went down to the hospital, saw them, prayed with them, wept with them. She was going to have to give birth to her child. And then I left, and they were able to do that. So this week has just been really walking with them. I don't want to say through it. We're still in the midst of it. And I just want to say for all the people that have responded here at Hope, man, I'm really encouraged with the way people stepped up. And there's not a lot you can do, but that what you could do, you did. We put up on the city, we're going to have a memorial service. We were thinking maybe 50 people. I don't know how many exactly came, but I'm thinking it's 130 or so, roughly. We had 80-some people sign up on the city, and within an hour and a half, all of the roles and things we asked for people to bring food for the reception, all of that was filled. And that's a big deal. We're a church. We're 14 years old as a church, which is maybe a long time, I guess, as a church to be 14. But we're a different kind of church, if you haven't figured that out by now. We have such great sound equipment, first of all. And we're a different kind of church, and we don't have this long tradition. This isn't a church that you went to and your parents went to, and you just know that. Matter of fact, for many of you, this is your first church experience. We don't have, and I don't mean this in any way derogatorily or anything like that, so if I offend you by what I'm about to say, I don't mean to, and Cora's happy to field all the emails if you do get offended. But we don't have the little old ladies that just take care of everything. We don't have that. We don't have that. You're raised in that. And so we kind of had to learn that. And I'm just really proud of this body. But what I want to walk you through tonight is we've been talking about the gospel, and for a lot of people have said this has been a very great series for them. And something happens when you're faced with a tragedy like this that shakes you, so it's not just this theoretical thing anymore, it's much more than that. So I want to talk tonight about the gospel and grief. The gospel and grief. If you've been around me for any period of time, you know that I like this guy. Go ahead, a couple there. This guy right here, anybody know who that is? Clive Staples, very nice. Clive Staples Lewis. If your name was Clive Staples Lewis, you'd go by CS as well. Yeah. It's interesting. A lot of people have these initials, and then you find out what their names are, and it's like, dude, stay with the initials. It's much better. But this is Clive Staples Lewis. He was born in 1898. He was a committed atheist from the age of 14. He went through a major deal. In fact, does anybody know part of who was very influential in C.S. Lewis? J.R. Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was very influential in C.S. Lewis's life. And in 1929, I want to make sure I get that date right, 1929, C.S. Lewis becomes a born-again theist. In other words, he becomes a person who believes there's some supreme being out there. But he's not going to tell what that is or anything. He's just going to believe that there's a God. And it's a huge deal for C.S. Lewis. One of my favorite quotes of his is where in that period of time where he was a very committed atheist, he was very angry at God for not existing. Isn't that a great quote? I was very angry at God for not existing. Very committed. He becomes a theist, someone who believes that there's a God. And then it takes 2 more years for him to come from the point where there's a God to becoming a follower of Jesus. And that's in 1931. In 1940, so 9 years later, he's talking to a lot of people about what's gone on in his life. In 1940, he writes a book, and it's a book to explain how there can be a good God, yet we have problems in the world. The book is called The Problem of Pain. It's a very important book that's out there for wrestling through the issue of if there really is a good God, how then can you have evil in the world? And it's a great book, and there's many quotes. Let me give you a few quotes from this really, really important book that C.S. Lewis wrote. He said this, and all these are just priceless. He said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. He also said in this book, he said, we regard God as an airman regards his parachute. Airman meaning a pilot of an airplane. And so you're flying the airplane, you're doing fine, and you just think, I've got this thing under control. It's there for emergency, but he hopes he'll never have to actually use it. He also says in this book, he says, God will look to every soul like its first love because he is its first love. So this is 1940. He writes this book about pain and the problem of it all. And then he's a bachelor most of his life. It's not until 1957 that C.S. Lewis falls in love. He's 59 years old. Some of you guys are thinking, whoa, I don't know if I can wait that long. But he's 59 years old. And at 59 years old, he meets a woman. Her name is Helen, but he called her Joy. He falls in love with her. She's got cancer, and she's in remission. She's going through it, but she's in the hospital. In the hospital, they get married. In the hospital, in 1957, he's 59 years old. He falls head over heels for this woman, who 3 years later, her cancer returns, and this time, she doesn't recover. She dies. So he's only married to her for 3 years of his life. He writes then a second book. It's not really a book. It's just a collection of his thoughts that he's had during this journey. And this second book is called A Grief Observed. This book is a little bit different than the first book. This book is extremely raw. This is someone talking from their soul. This is someone who is a very, very disappointed and has gone through incredible grief. And it's called A Grief Observed. He doesn't claim that it's inspired or it has anything. He's just saying, this is my experience. He, in fact, is embarrassed by it, and he writes it under a pen name. It's not until after his death that people put his name on it. So he didn't want anybody else to know this is what he went through. But let me read some of his, because now we're talking about grief. And this is some of the things he writes about. He says, you never know how much you really believe anything until its truth or falsehood becomes a matter of life and death to you. It is easy for you, I believe that should be, to believe a rope to be strong and sound as long as you are merely using it to cord a box. But suppose that you had to hang by that rope over a precipice. Wouldn't you then first discover how much you really trusted it? Only a real risk tests the reality of a belief. And that's what he's saying. He's been a follower of Jesus now for many years. And he's saying, this faith that I have is seriously being tested. Some of the other outpourings he has, he says this: you can't see anything properly while your eyes are blurred with tears. He said this, he's talking about his experience now, and he says, at other times it feels like being drunk or concussed. Means you've just had a concussion, you had your bell rung. There is a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting. Yet I want the others to be about me. In other words, I want them to be there. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me. He wants them there, but he doesn't want them to say anything to him. And what about his relationship with God? He says this: meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms when you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you are tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption. If you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But, and now this is raw here, just get ready. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. You hear this? This is a man who's going through grief. He talks about that grief, and he says this in A Grief Observed. He says, I once read the sentence, I lay awake all night with a toothache, thinking about toothache and about laying awake. He says that's true to life. Part of every misery is, so to speak, the misery's shadow or reflection. The fact that you don't merely suffer, but have to keep on thinking about the fact that you suffer. I not only live each endless day in grief, but live each day thinking about living each day in grief. It's heavy. And then he says this. He's talking about, the paragraph that follows, or comes before this is where he's talking about, it seems like things were going to get better with joy, like they were getting x-rays that looked like things were getting better, but then it get worse, and it looked like getting better, and it was getting worse. And he says this, he says, time after time, when he's talking about God, seemed most gracious, he was really preparing the next torture. And then he writes this next sentence. He says, I wrote that last night. It was a yell rather than a thought. Now, like I said, this message tonight can be for some of you. Maybe you're going through this, and we go through the cards, and I know there's hard things, very hard things, tragic things. I misspoke this morning. I said 2, but I've done 3. I've only done 3 funerals. 14 years, 3 funerals. That's incredible. And the only one that I've been a part of, and I wasn't doing the funeral, I just did the burial, was my father-in-law that was an adult. We have been spared as a church body. That's unheard of. And yet I know outside and in your networks of relationships, there's a lot of tragedies. And so maybe that's where you're at tonight. Maybe you're not here. Maybe you need to help someone. And maybe this is just storage in the bank for when you go through that. So I want to talk tonight about the gospel and grief. The flowers right here are to memorialize little Jairus Irvin Hintz. And right on the communion table here is where his little body lay on Friday. He's named from Mark chapter 5. And I want to read that. I want to read another passage tonight as we kind of look at this issue of the gospel and grief. Mark chapter 5. I don't have any inserts tonight. Mark chapter 5. Just have to pay attention to the screen or open your Bible. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him. My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. So Jesus went with him. Now you got to understand what's going on here a little bit. for a synagogue ruler who at this time already, Jesus is a threat. Jesus is pushing in on their business. Jesus is Jewish, but he's kind of an outsider, and to be identified with him will very quickly cut you off from your people. And this guy's a ruler. But what does this situation do? It makes him desperate. I'll do anything. My little girl is dying. So Jesus goes with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? The disciples are like, what? You see people crowd all around you, and yet you asked, who touched me? But Jesus could tell somebody touched him, expecting something. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Okay, so Jairus, the synagogue ruler, comes, and he is wanting Jesus to, let's go to my daughter. And meanwhile, there's this woman who comes, and it takes time to deal with this woman. It takes time to deal with what her needs are. And so as a result, time passes. While Jesus was speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler, and he said, your daughter's dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, don't be afraid, just believe. I love that phrase. Ignoring what they said. Ignoring what they said. Jesus looked at the synagogue ruler and says, don't be afraid, just believe. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. Okay, so there's all these wailers and criers. And in that culture, it was not uncommon. It sounds a little bizarre to us, but you would perhaps hire people, professional mourners, to come be part of your deal. And so they're not really emotionally involved. And Jesus says, the little child isn't dead, but they're asleep. They laugh at him. So what does Jesus do? He puts them out. They're not going to get to see the miracle. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and he told them to give her something to eat. This is the passage that our elder, Mark Hintz, had decided a while ago that he wanted, they didn't know if it was going to be a boy or girl. And this was the passage that he had decided he wanted to name the little boy, if it was a boy. Now, the interesting thing is that Carol and I went over and had dinner with them on Wednesday night. Tuesday's when they lost the baby, and then Wednesday we went over. And we were chatting about this, and I said, I think it's so cool that you both had decided that Jairus would be the name, given this great account and, what happened and everything. And Mark said, well, to be honest, I was still working on her on the name. So it wasn't yet completely for sure that was going to be the name. But then, given all this, Meg thought that would be a great name, Jairus. And the phrase that has just really sustained them, one of the phrases, has been this, don't be afraid, just believe. Now, in my devotional life, I'm going through the book of John. And on Thursday morning, I gave Mark a call, and I had just got done reading John chapter 11. And I gave Mark a call, and he said, yeah, if you could come and help me. We went to work with the funeral home. We talked, they were great to work with, great people. That's a tough line of work. I very much Some are not so good, but most are great, great people. Worked with them, and then we planned the funeral. And I read John 11. And I want to read that tonight, because John 11 is a passage that if you're going through grief, I think John 11 is just must reading for understanding what God is up to. So this is another passage where Jesus is dealing with this very tough thing. It says, now a certain man was sick. This is Jesus' very good friend, Lazarus. You're going to see that he has a special care for them. The village of Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was the Martha who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent word to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, the sickness will not end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Now Jesus loves everybody, okay? But there's this feeling here that he just really is emotive towards these three. And it says he loved them. Look at the next word. So, that means, therefore, when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. That little word, so, there's a very important word. That little word, so, there's a very important word when you're dealing with God. He loved them, so he doesn't go. He waits. Really? Really. Then after he'd said to his disciples, then after this he said to his disciples, let us go up to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you are going to go there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he will not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. Then he said, after he'd said that to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go, so that I might awaken him out of sleep. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, that's a good thing, he'll recover. Now Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Therefore Thomas, who's later called Doubting Thomas gets a bum rap. Look at Thomas here, who's also called Didymus, said to the other disciples, let us go also, so that we may die with him. Thomas was a doubter, but he was no coward. I mean, he's willing to go. But he needed to have proof, and he had proof here, and he was willing to go. So when Jesus comes, he's getting close to the city. He's not yet in the city. He'd heard that Lazarus, he had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house. One of the sisters runs out. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe. I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. When she had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now, Jesus had not yet come into the village, but he was staying in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house, and consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled and said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." And then the shortest verse in the Bible. I talked about this last week. Jesus wept. Now, those two passages, Mark 5, John 11, are the basis of what I want to talk about the remainder of our time. I want to talk about 7 things, 7 ways to preach to yourself about the gospel and grief. Not just talking about sadness, I'm talking about grief. From your toes, it boils up. The gospel and grief. First thing. The gospel produces grief produces at times within you words that are for the wind. Job talks about this. If you're familiar at all with this account of Job in the Old Testament, he goes through this terrible suffering, and there's some friends that come to console him, and he kind of mouths off some stuff, and they correct him. They're all about correcting him and making him get his facts exactly, get his theology exactly right. And Job says to him, "Are you kidding me?" Paraphrase. "Are you kidding me? Are you really going to rebuke a man who's speaking words that belong to the wind?" In other words, there are things coming out of my mouth. You cannot just judge them. When you're going through grief, or when you're around someone who's going through grief, they will say things that will not be 100% accurate. It's just, there are no words for the depths of the grief that they had. C.S. Lewis says, in A Grief Observed, he says, "No one ever told me that grief would feel so much like intense fear." And just this stuff comes out. When you're afraid, really afraid, you might scream or you might be petrified and shaken. These things come out. Now, after I talked about this first service, someone came to me and said they'd just gone through a whole grieving thing, and they had friends who told them, "Yeah, you really need to control that, because you don't want to go out and do a lot of things that you shouldn't say or shouldn't do." And to some degree, that's true. That's true. I'm not advocating go do whatever you want. You're grieving. At the same time, things will come to your mind. In C.S. Lewis's case, he doubted the goodness of God. Well, God, are you really good, or were you just kind of torturing me? He doubted that. Now, he didn't land there. He didn't stay there. The thing about grief is, yes, some things will come out that are not pretty. It'll be ugly. What you pray for your friend, what you pray for yourself, is that it doesn't slip to bitterness. Second thing. And this is, if you're a guy especially, this is what you're going to try to do. I don't know what it is. I think guys, we're just really, really uncomfortable with our emotions. We do anger well, and we yell at the TV when the Vikings don't do well, or if the Packers do well. And I know some of your Packer fans are going, "Yes, that was great. I pray for you." So, but we don't know what to do with grief. We let it slip into anger. Okay? We don't know what to do. And when we see someone that we love in pain, we just want it to be fixed. I just want it to go away. What can I do that will fix it? And so if you're married here tonight, I just got a word for you. There's nothing you can do to fix it. Just stop. And your spouse might even be telling you, if you did this, it would fix it. It's not going to fix it. It's not going to fix it at all. The reason for that is the third thing. And this is really, really important. What grief does, especially the loss of someone who has died, is screams to your very essence of who you are, "I was not made for here. I was not made for a world where people die. I was not made for a time when we get 6 o'clock in the morning phone calls. On Monday morning, they're thinking, I'm having a baby. On Friday, we're doing a funeral and laying the child to rest in a grave. If you want to help that make sense, it makes no sense. There is no way that you can compute that. It's like, well, okay, I just need to know why. There is no why. It's because we live in a fallen world. When Carol and I went over to Meg and Mark's house on Wednesday night and had dinner with them, Mark said two things that I will take to my grave remembering. They were so prophetic. I'll share one of them here and I'll share one of them in a little bit. The first one was we were sitting around the table talking, and he was talking about what it was like to hold his son who had no life in him. He never took a breath. He's holding his son, and he said, this thought came to me, and the thought was, I hate sin. Look at the collateral damage of what Adam and Eve did to my son. When sin entered the world and death entered the world, this explosion happened that killed all these people all around. To hate sin like that. Death is not a natural part of life. If you hear that at a funeral, I give you full permission to stand up and scream, no! It almost happened at this one. Someone kind of was going off and talking about something during the funeral, and I thought, I'm going to have to be the guy that stands up and says no, which is going to be kind of weird. It's not a natural part of life. Death is not that's why it doesn't feel right. Going to bathroom is a normal part of life. You just do that, right? And no one really cares a whole lot. It's not like you don't make meals for them or whatever. You just do that. That's a natural part of life. Death is not. That is why it always feels wrong. It always feels wrong. You and I were not created for here. You and I are created to live in the Garden of Eden. Fourth thing. These next two actually are hard, but if you don't hold them both, you will be locked in letting grief slip into bitterness. Fourth one is Jesus Christ is in absolute control. You see that clearly in the story of Jairus, who comes. This woman's there. He takes his time. He does everything on his control. You see it clearly in the story of Lazarus. It says he loved them, then he stays. He doesn't go. He waits. He's in complete control of the whole situation. That is one of the hardest things to actually believe, especially when you're going through really, really difficult times. But I would go crazy if I didn't believe that. Carol and I stopped getting the paper years ago, just too much to try to read it all and everything. And on New Year's Eve, my boys, we went up to the Osters, Carol and Stan's place, and they were having this FCA night. It was about, 60 kids, and they were playing broomball, and so I dropped the kids off, and I was kind of waiting for them, and they were going to be like another hour, so I thought, man, I'm really thirsty. I think I'll go over to Mickey D's and grab a pop because I'm cheap. $1.60 now for a pop. Mickey D's. I know, I'm sounding like my dad. Oh, it used to be a quarter. Anyway, it was $1.60 for a pop. And so I thought, I'm going to get my money's worth. There was all these, they were just going to close up, so I grabbed all these papers. And I said, okay, if I take the papers, I'm kind of that age now where I could be that crotchety guy, like, what are they going to do? Say no? So I took all the papers, and I'm walking out. And I bring them home, and Carol's reading them the next day. And she says, I know now why we don't get the paper. It's just filled with bad news. And she starts listing it. Oh, there's just things going on in Afghanistan. She's reading them. This guy fell who was just trying to get his ice dam. Actually, one of our daughter churches. It's a person who goes to that church, their neighbor next door. So, I mean, it's just all this. She just lists it all off. I'm thinking, man, I'm really depressed. This is terrible. That's just a microcosm of what's going on. This is our little Minneapolis, right? Read the back of the card sometime. If you don't actually believe in a God who's in control, if you don't sleep like a Calvinist, you'll go crazy. You have to believe in a God who's in control. But you also have to believe in a God, and this is where it gets hard. And the fifth thing is this. Not only is Jesus Christ in control, Jesus Christ weeps with you. The passage there in John chapter 11, it says he was deeply moved and troubled in spirit. What that really means is, if you translate it, and the way that was used in that language is, he snorted like a horse. In other words, there was goo coming out of Jesus. Jesus lost it. Now, I know, this is hard. I'm not pretending to understand this. The line of mystery has been drawn, and I'm on the other side of it. I don't get it. But Jesus waits. Jesus waits. He doesn't go and heal him. He gets there, and he sees what's happened. Lazarus has died. Everybody's mourning. He loses it, and he knows, and you know if you know the account, that in a couple verses, he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. And that's what I love about Jesus. That he goes through things and he's in complete control. And whatever you're going through tonight, Jesus weeps with you. He mourns with you. He holds you. But if you don't hold those two at the same time, you'll lose it. That Christ is in complete control, and Christ also weeps with you. Don't try to get it. Just bask in it and take it. The sixth thing is that Jesus Christ actually gave his life for our grief. See, you and I were not made for this. You and I are not made to live here. We're made to live in the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden is closed. We can't get back into it. And since that time, there's been a crescendo of different things happening, coming finally to the place where Christ came as our Savior. He died in our place. He gave up his life and died in our place to take our sin. And that's no small thing. It is a redemption plan. So ultimately, not now. It starts now in new life. If you're a follower of Jesus, that's what I was going to talk about tonight. I'll talk about that on the 23rd. The new life starts now, definitely. But it's not full restoration until Revelation 21:22, in a time that's coming. Christ died, paid your penalty. Second thing that Mark said on Wednesday night was about this. He was struck in the gospel accounts how it talks about the lifeless body of Jesus. And he said to me, again, one of those moments that's frozen in time for me, I'll never forget. He said to me and Carol, as he was holding his lifeless son, he said, I think I have a glimpse of how the Father felt as he saw the lifeless body of Jesus come off the cross and be put in the tomb. The lifeless body. Christ did that for you. Preach that to yourself. The last thing tonight, in talking about the gospel and grief, I want to read a passage that I read as we committed Jairus to the grave. And it's a passage Paul wrote to the people of Thessalonica. In Thessalonica, there's an inscription at the time when this was written, which said, after death, no revival. After death, we'll never meet again. And Paul's going to rebuke that and give this passage. And he says this. He says, brothers, we do not want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep or to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. We believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Lord's own word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left till the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage each other with these words. Who do you encourage? Those who've lost loved ones. Why? Because they're grieving. The gospel and the fact that we have a Redeemer and that we are going back to Eden. It's called heaven, new heavens, new earth, whatever name you want to give it. There is a restoration coming. That's the seventh thing. Seventh thing is grieving is a cry of the very depths of our soul of the way it should be. A place, Revelation 21 talks about this in one of my favorite passages, 21:4. It's talking about God. It's speaking of him as if he's down on one knee, and it says, he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. When you're going through that, or when you're helping somebody go through that, that is a cry to the way things should be. It's a cry that the gospel is true. It is a cry for your restoration. Which brings us to this table. On Friday, we had the funeral and the little casket of Jairus on this table. And now we have the bread and the cup, which represents symbolically the body of Jesus. 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says that when you do communion, when you come together as a body, and you take a piece of bread, and you take a cup, and you remember Jesus, what you do actually, he says, is you proclaim the Lord's death until he returns. You're proclaiming it. You're preaching the gospel to yourself, saying, if I don't have this, this is my only hope. So we invite you to a time of response, a time of communion. I know if it's anything like this morning, I know tonight's message was heavy, and there'll be people to pray for you afterwards. If you'd like to have somebody pray for you, if you're going through a grievous time, a time where you're really struggling, people would love to pray with you about that. Let's pray together.